Hello and welcome back to the channel. In this second video of the playlist, we'll talk about Freud's opinion on Le Bon's portrayal of the mass mind. If you're interested in Le Bon's work, we also have a playlist on that, so you should check it out in our channel page. Curious to know more? Let's begin. Rather than preface these remarks with a definition, it would seem more useful to begin by referring to the published literature and extracting from it a few particularly striking and typical facts that the investigation can take as its starting point. We shall achieve both by quoting an excerpt from Le Bon's rightly famous book, The Crowd. Let us remind ourselves of the facts of the case. If psychology, which traces the predispositions, drive impulses, motives, and intentions of the individual through to his actions and into the individual's relationships to those closest to him, had done its job completely and rendered all these connections transparent, it would suddenly find itself facing a fresh and as yet unperformed task. It would be required to explain the astonishing fact that, given a certain condition, the individual whom it has come to understand will feel, think, and act quite otherwise than expected, that condition being incorporation into a body of people that has taken on the quality of a psychological mass. But what is a mass? How does it acquire the ability so decisively to influence the mental life of the individual? And in what does the mental change it imposes on the individual consist? Answering these three questions is the task facing theoretical mass psychology. Clearly, the best way to tackle them is by starting with the third. It is observation of the altered reaction of the individual that is the stuff of mass psychology. The fact is, every attempt to explain something needs to be preceded by a description of what is to be explained. Now, over to Le Bon. He writes, "The most striking peculiarity presented by a psychological crowd is the following. Whoever be the individuals that compose it, however like or unlike be their mode of life, their occupations, their character, or their intelligence, the fact that they have been transformed into a crowd puts them in possession of a sort of collective mind which makes them feel, think, and act in a manner quite different from that in which each individual of them would feel, think, and act were he in a state of isolation. There are certain ideas and feelings which do not come into being, or do not transform themselves into acts except in the case of individuals forming a crowd. The psychological crowd is a provisional being formed of heterogeneous elements, which for a moment are combined, exactly as the cells which constitute a living body form, by their reunion, a new being which displays characteristics very different from those possessed by each of the cells singly. Taking the liberty of interrupting Le Bon's account with comments of our own, we beg to remark at this point, if the individuals in the mass are bound together to form an entity, there must presumably be something binding them together, and that binding medium might be precisely what characterizes the mass. Le Bon, however, leaves this question unanswered, dealing instead with the way in which the individual changes in the mass, and describing the change in terms that chime well with the basic premises of our depth psychology. It is easy to prove how much the individual forming part of a crowd differs from the isolated individual, but it is less easy to discover the causes of this difference. To obtain at any rate a glimpse of them, it is necessary in the first place to call to mind the truth established by modern psychology, that unconscious phenomena play an altogether preponderating part, not only in organic life but also in the operations of the intelligence. The conscious life of the mind is of small importance in comparison with its unconscious life. The most subtle analyst, the most acute observer, is scarcely successful in discovering more than a very small number of the unconscious motives that determine his conduct. Our conscious acts are the outcome of an unconscious substratum, created in the mind in the main by hereditary influences. This substratum consists of the innumerable common characteristics handed down from generation to generation which constitute the genius of a race. Behind the avowed causes of our acts, there undoubtedly lie secret causes that we do not avow. But behind these secret causes, there are many others more secret still, which we ourselves ignore. The greater part of our daily actions are the result of hidden motives, which escape our observation. In the mass, Le Bon believes, individual acquisitions are effaced, which means that the uniqueness of the individual disappears. The racial unconscious comes to the fore, the heterogeneous is swamped by the homogeneous. We would say that the psychical superstructure that had developed so variously in individuals is eroded away, enfeebled, and the unconscious foundation that is the same for everyone is exposed, activated. In this way, it is alleged, an average nature of the individuals forming the mass comes about. However, Le Bon finds that those individuals also evince fresh qualities, ones they did not possess before, and he looks for the reason in three different factors. The first is that the individual forming part of a crowd acquires, solely from numerical considerations, a sentiment of invincible power which allows him to yield to instincts which, had he been alone, he would perforce have kept under restraint. He will be the less disposed to check himself from the consideration that, a crowd being anonymous and in consequence irresponsible, the sentiment of responsibility which always controls individuals disappears entirely. From our standpoint, we should not need to place so much emphasis on the emergence of fresh qualities. All we should want to say is that, in the mass, the individual finds himself in conditions that allow him to shed the repressions of his unconscious drive impulses. The apparently fresh qualities that the individual then exhibits are in fact expressions of that unconscious, along with which, as we know, everything wicked in the human mind comes enclosed. The disappearance of conscience or sense of responsibility in such circumstances does not present our understanding with any difficulty. We had long contended that the core of what is called conscience is social anxiety. The second cause, which is contagion, also intervenes to determine the manifestation in crowds of their special characteristics and at the same time the trend they are to take. Contagion is a phenomenon of which it is easy to establish the presence, but that it is not easy to explain. It must be classed among those phenomena of a hypnotic order which we shall shortly study. In a crowd, every sentiment and act is contagious, and contagious to such a degree that an individual readily sacrifices his personal interest to the collective interest. This is an aptitude very contrary to his nature, and of which a man is scarcely capable except when he makes part of a crowd. We shall return to that last sentence later, basing an important supposition on it. A third cause, and by far the most important, determines in the individuals of a crowd special characteristics which are quite contrary at times to those presented by the isolated individual. I allude to that suggestibility of which, moreover, the contagion mentioned above is neither more nor less than an effect. To understand this phenomenon, it is necessary to bear in mind certain recent physiological discoveries. We know today that by various processes, an individual may be brought into such a condition that, having entirely lost his conscious personality, he obeys all the suggestions of the operator who has deprived him of it and commits acts in utter contradiction with his character and habits. The most careful observations seem to prove that an individual emerged for some length of time in a crowd in action soon finds himself, either in consequence of the magnetic influence given out by the crowd, or from some other cause of which we are ignorant, in a special state which much resembles the state of fascination, in which the hypnotized individual finds himself in the hands of the hypnotizer. The conscious personality has entirely vanished. Will and discernment are lost. All feelings and thoughts are bent in the direction determined by the hypnotizer. Such also is approximately the state of the individual forming part of a psychological crowd. He is no longer conscious of his acts. In his case, as in the case of the hypnotized subject, at the same time that certain faculties are destroyed, others may be brought to a high degree of exaltation. Under the influence of a suggestion, he will undertake the accomplishment of certain acts with irresistible impetuosity. This impetuosity is the more irresistible in the case of crowds than in that of the hypnotized subject, from the fact that, the suggestion being the same for all the individuals of the crowd, it gains in strength by reciprocity. We see, then, that the disappearance of the conscious personality, the predominance of the unconscious personality, the turning by means of suggestion and contagion of feelings and ideas in an identical direction, the tendency to immediately transform the suggested ideas into acts. These, we see, are the principal characteristics of the individual forming part of a crowd. He is no longer himself, but has become an automaton who has ceased to be guided by his will. I reproduce this quotation at such length in order to confirm that Le Bon really does explain the state of the individual in the mass as a hypnotic one, rather than merely comparing it with such a state. It is not our intention here to contradict Le Bon. We simply wish to stress that the last two reasons for the change affecting the individual in the mass, namely contagion and heightened suggestibility, are clearly not of the same kind. Indeed, contagion is also said to be an expression of suggestibility. Moreover, Le Bon's text does not seem to us to draw any sharp distinction between the effects of the two factors. Possibly the best way to interpret what he says is by relating contagion to the effect that the individual members of the mass have on one another, whereas the manifestations of suggestion in the mass, which are equated with the phenomena of hypnotic influence, point to a different source. But to what? We cannot help seeing it as a substantial shortcoming that one of the chief players in this assimilation, namely the person who, for the mass, occupies the place of the hypnotist, is not mentioned in Le Bon's account. He does, though, distinguish this unexplained fascinating influence from the contagious effect that individuals have on one another, as a result of which the original suggestion is reinforced. One other important viewpoint as regards assessing the mass individual. Moreover, by the mere fact that he forms part of an organized crowd, a man descends several rungs in the ladder of civilization. Isolated, he may be a cultivated individual. In a crowd, he is a barbarian. That is, a creature acting by instinct. He possesses the spontaneity, the violence, the ferocity, and also the enthusiasm and heroism of primitive beings. Le Bon then dwells particularly on the reduced intellectual performance that the individual experiences in consequence of being swallowed up in the mass. Let us now leave the individual and turn to the description of the mass mind, as outlined by Le Bon. There is not a single feature of it, the derivation and placing of which would cause the psychoanalyst problems. Le Bon even shows us the way by pointing to the congruence with the mental life of savages and children. The mass is impulsive, inconstant, and excitable. It is guided almost exclusively by unconscious motives. The impulses that the mass obeys may, depending on circumstances, be noble or cruel, heroic or cowardly, but at all events they are so imperious that no personal interest, not even that of self-preservation, is able to assert itself. Nothing about it is premeditated. It may desire things passionately, but never for long. It is incapable of any long-term intention. It cannot abide any delay between its desire and realization of the thing desired. It has a sense of omnipotence. For the individual in the mass, the concept of impossibility vanishes. The mass is extraordinarily suggestible and credulous. It is uncritical. The improbable does not exist so far as it is concerned. It thinks in images that evoke one another by association, as they appear to the individual in states of free fantasizing, images that no reasonable agency gauges in terms of their congruence with reality. The feelings of the mass are always extremely simple and extremely effusive. The mass, in other words, knows neither doubt nor uncertainty. It instantly goes to extremes. In it, a suspicion, once voiced, turns immediately into incontrovertible evidence. A seed of antipathy becomes furious hatred. Itself tending to every extreme, the mass is also only excited by immoderate stimuli. Anyone seeking to move it needs no logical calibration in his arguments, but must paint with the most powerful images, exaggerate, and say the same thing over and over again. Since the mass has no doubt about what is true or false, and is at the same time aware of its immense strength, it is as intolerant as it is accepting of authority. It respects strength and is only moderately influenced by the good, which it sees simply as a kind of weakness. What it expects in its heroes is brawn, even a tendency to violence. It wants to be dominated and suppressed and to fear its master. Basically conservative in all things, it has a deep aversion to all innovation and progress and an immeasurable reverence for tradition. In order to reach a correct assessment of the morality of masses, it is important to consider that when people are together in a mass, all individual inhibitions fall away, and all the cruel, brutal, destructive instincts that lie dormant in the individual as a leftover from primitive times are roused to free drive satisfaction. However, masses are also capable, under the influence of suggestion, of great feats of renunciation, disinterestedness, and devotion to an ideal. Whereas personal advantage is more or less the only driving force present in the case of the isolated individual, in masses it very seldom predominates. The individual may even be said to be rendered moral by the mass. Whereas the intellectual output of the mass is invariably way below that of the individual, its ethical behavior can rise as far above that level as it can descend below it. Certain other features of Le Bon's account further highlight the justification for identifying the mass mind with the mind of the primitive. In masses, the most antagonistic ideas may exist alongside one another and accommodate one another without their logical contradiction giving rise to conflict. This is also the case, however, in the unconscious mental lives of individuals, of children, and of neurotics, as psychoanalysis proved long ago. The mass is also subject to the truly magical power of words, which are capable of conjuring up the most fearful storms in the mass mind and also of calming them. Reason and arguments are incapable of combating certain words and formulas. These are uttered with solemnity in the presence of crowds, and as soon as they have been pronounced, an expression of respect is visible on every countenance, and all heads are bowed. By many, they are considered as natural forces, as supernatural powers. One need think no further in this context than the taboo on names amongst primitives, of the magical forces that, for primitives, attach to names and words. And finally, masses have never known the thirst for truth. They demand illusions they cannot do without them. The unreal has almost as much influence on them as the real. They have an evident tendency not to distinguish between the two. This predominance of the life of the imagination and of illusion, as borne by unsatisfied desire, are things that we have pointed out as characterizing the psychology of neuroses. We found that what matters for neurotics is not ordinary objective reality, but psychical reality, that a hysterical symptom is grounded in fantasy rather than in the rehearsal of actual experience. The guilty conscience of a compulsive neurotic in the fact of an evil design that was never carried out. Indeed, as in dream and hypnosis, so in the mental activity of the mass. Examination of reality retreats before the strength of effectively charged wishful feelings. What Le Bon says about leaders of masses is less well thought out and does not let laws shine through so clearly. He says that as soon as living beings come together in certain numbers, be they a herd of animals or a multitude of people, they instinctively place themselves under the authority of a head. The mass is a docile herd, never capable of living without a master. So powerful is its thirst to obey that, should anyone appoint himself its master, it will instinctively bow down to him. If the needs of the mass favor the leader in this way, the leader must nevertheless possess personal qualities that suit the mass. He must himself be enthralled to a powerful belief in an idea if he is to inspire belief in the mass. He must possess a powerful, commanding will that the will-less mass breathes in from him. Le Bon goes on to talk about the various types of leader and the means by which they influence the mass. In general, he derives the importance of leaders from the ideas of which they are themselves fanatical supporters. Furthermore, he ascribes to such ideas as well as to leaders a mysterious, irresistible power that he calls prestige. Prestige is a type of dominance that an individual, a piece of work, or an idea exercises over us. It paralyzes our entire critical faculty and fills us with astonishment and respect. It should arouse a sentiment similar to that of the fascination of hypnosis. He draws a distinction between acquired or artificial prestige and personal prestige. The former is conveyed in the case of persons by name, wealth, reputation. In the case of notions, works of art, and the like, it is conveyed by tradition. Since in all cases it draws upon the past, it can do little to explain this puzzling influence. Personal prestige attaches to a small number of persons who become leaders as a result. It causes everyone to obey them as if under the effect of a magnetic spell. However, prestige of any kind also relies on success and will be eroded by failures. One does not gain the impression that, in Le Bon's work, the role of leaders and the emphasis on prestige are brought into proper harmony with his quite brilliant portrayal of the mass mind. If you enjoyed this video, you might want to check the books available in our link in the description. There you'll find many fundamental marketing books in different languages. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more marketing-related content. See you in the next one.